We've already seen that the nullable property allows indicating that the value of an attribute that is a foreign key can be left unspecified, or unassigned, so that in this case, Genexus does not trigger the corresponding referential integrity checks. On the other hand, we know that if an attribute does not accept nulls, then a valid value must always be indicated. Within a knowledge base, the relationship between entities is defined by primary keys, which can be foreign keys when they're included in other entities. Whether a foreign key accepts nulls or not lets Genexus know how strong the references are between those entities. For example, consider the country and attraction transactions as shown below. Based on this transaction design, Genexus will create the country and country-city tables that we're looking at. We know that in the case of the attraction transaction, the attribute pair country ID, city ID make up a compound foreign key. As for the structure of the attraction table associated with the attraction transaction, it's the one that we're looking at. In addition, Genexus will also automatically create the following indexes: the primary index by attraction ID, and the foreign index by the attribute pair country ID, city ID. Let's see it in Genexus. In the structure of the attraction transaction, we can see that by default, both attributes, country ID and city ID, have the nullable property set to no. This means that the values indicated in them must always be valid. In other words, the value pair must exist in the country-city table as a primary key. Okay, let's press F5. Note that the impact analysis report shows that the corresponding reference to the country-city table will be created. Let's reorganize. And we enter a tourist attraction. For example, we enter the Eiffel Tower. And select the country France, but we don't enter a city ID, and the corresponding error message is displayed. The same message will appear if in city ID we enter a value that doesn't exist. In other words, the pair made up of the values indicated in country ID and city ID must exist as a primary key in the country-city table. Let's return to Genexus. What will happen if, for example, in the structure of the attraction transaction, we indicate that the city ID attribute accepts nulls? When a foreign key is composed of more than one attribute, and the null value is allowed in any of its parts, then new references must be defined if the rest of the attributes are also a foreign key, as it happens in this case, since country ID is also a foreign key. So, if in the attraction transaction we indicate that the city ID attribute accepts nulls, it will imply that Genexus will not make the corresponding referential integrity checks on the country-city table when the value of this attribute is not indicated. Genexus will then create a reference to the country table to avoid indicating a country ID value that doesn't exist in that table as a primary key, when the city ID value is not entered. Let's return to Genexus and check this behavior at runtime. We press F5, and if we look at the impact analysis report, we can see that Genexus added a new reference over the country table. We reorganize, and we'll try to enter the Eiffel Tower again, but indicating only a valid value in country ID and leaving city ID blank. We select France without indicating a value for city ID and confirm. Genexus only checked that the country ID value is valid, that is, that it existed as a primary key in the country table. Now let's see what happens if we indicate a value in city ID, but a value that's not valid. When an invalid value is entered in city ID, Genexus displays the corresponding error message. The reason for this is that when a city ID value is entered, Genexus does make the corresponding controls on the country city table. Therefore, the pair indicated in country ID and city ID must exist as a primary key in that table.